This is a recreation of the map I drew while playing Castlevania II Simon's Quest for the first time. While this map looks illegible, and certainly is for any outsider, to me, it makes perfect sense. That is definitely a moral victory that carried me through about half of Simon's Quest before I could no longer resist the urge to fail and look up a guide. That's okay, because games are about more than guide usage, and the joys of Simon's Quest are akin to digging through the sweaty leftovers of a vintage clothing store. For many, Castlevania II Simon's Quest is most notable as the first episode of Angry Video Game Nerd. While I adore those videos, they unfortunately stack the deck against Simon's Quest, a game that's not quite good, but better than bad. I think Simon's Quest deserves love. So welcome to part 2 of our Castlevania NES retrospective, where we'll dig deep below the farts and the poop and into the Released for the Famicom Disk System in August 1987, less than a year after the original game, Castlevania II Simon's Quest picks up right where the original left off. At the end of the first game, Simon sent Dracula's fucking head to the moon. At that moment, Simon was cursed and the pieces of Dracula were scattered. Simon's body is wasting away, and his only hope, as told to him by a mysterious maiden, is to destroy the parts of Dracula and destroy the curse of darkness once and for all. Simon's Quest is technically the third Castlevania game. It follows Vampire Killer, a remake of the first game for the MSX2. Vampire Killer replaces the linear levels of the original with a series of non-linear levels. Simon's Quest takes these non-linear elements and pushes them much further. Alongside the staple jumping and whipping, the player needs to find items, secrets, talk with villagers, and level up to destroy Dracula. The central crimes of Simon's Quest, as outlined by AVGN, are that much of its non-linearity is cryptic, and its combat encounters, specifically the bosses, are too easy and kinda lame. Both of these claims, by the way, are completely true. I wanted to beat the game without a guide to test the crypticness. Such an experiment can't be pure, since the most famous cryptic bits, especially the red crystal wall kneel, are burned in my head from AVGN. While I was definitely able to make progress with the maps and notes I showed off at the beginning, the game's a garbled mess, and I was eventually forced to relent. However, the problem with Simon's Quest isn't that it's random and indecipherable. As originally written, Simon's Quest is mostly reasonable, and its low difficulty, which we'll get to later, promotes experimentation, especially with regards to exploration. The problem is that the English translation is kind of a massive disaster. While the Japanese version also has cryptic messages and NPCs that provide incorrect knowledge, many of the actual helpful hints were mistranslated. Some are benign, like the famous "you are now possessed" lines, but others break the game. An NPC says, "Wait for a soul with a red crystal on Deborah Cliff," which is what, exactly? Stand near a cliff and wait for a soul to come with a red crystal? Does Simon have the red crystal? Does the soul have it? I already have a red crystal. And it isn't even just unclear sentences. The game also sometimes refers to items such as holy water with different names. A more accurate translation of the Japanese text done by Joel Ilioma is press a red crystal against the Deborah Cliff, kneel, and wait for a whirlwind. By having a better translation, one of the most famous cryptic video game puzzles isn't even a puzzle. It isn't cryptic, it's just told to the player. A lot of the confusion in the game is cleaned up by Ilioma's translation. Some examples of cryptic progression that's fixed by the better translation includes that holy water is used to destroy walls and floors, which in the official translation is described as the magic potion will destroy the wall of evil, and that many of the game's merchants are hiding beneath fake floors. This is all well and good, but the critiques of the translation are a little too mechanical. There are joys outside of being able to beat a game without a guide. The horrible translation might make the gameplay and progression worse, but it's also one of the most enjoyably bad translations on the NES. Lines like, "I beg of you, take these laurels. Don't look into the Death Star or you will die. Don't make me stay. I'll die." Dracula's eyeball reflects the curse, and "laurels in your soup enhances its aroma" are hilarious. Such rudimentary camp carries its own charm that you won't find in many other games and keeps the game consistently entertaining. Besides, having to look up a guide is hardly an unforgivable crime in the NES era. The Legend of Zelda and Metroid are both sanctified classics that more or less require guide use, especially Metroid. There are sections in Simon's Quest where save scumming or guide usage are simply the most time-efficient manner to figure some stuff out, since there are a couple of instances of hardcore trial and error. The most egregious is the garlic. Garlic is a consumable that can be used in a couple of spots to summon an NPC that will give you an item. A better translation would make it clear that the garlic needs to be dropped in cemeteries, but exactly where in the cemeteries is trial and error. It's not the worst trial and error imaginable, but since garlic is a limited consumable that you need to buy, it results in a lot of grinding if you organically figure out the solution rather than save scumming or looking it up. I can never tell if something I say is going to be controversial or not, so maybe this is, maybe it isn't, but Simon's Quest holds up better than Metroid. Like, a lot better. The signposting, even with the bad translation, is generally better in Simon's Quest, and the game understands that a non-linear adventure game should not be hyper-punishing. In Metroid, progression is often hyper-obscure, requiring extensive trial and error, and frequently uses consumables for said trial and error. When you die, you respawn with 30 HP and back at the beginning of the game. This is a game where your max HP ends up reaching the hundreds. Metroid is not a bad game, but its legacy compared to Simon's Quest is an interesting case study in how reputation affects reception. Simon's Quest is, conversely, a very forgiving game. This surprises me as it's sandwiched between a bunch of horrifyingly difficult games with the following 3 Castlevania titles, Haunted Castle, The Adventure, and Dracula's Curse being particular nightmares. Simon's Quest is a game that loves to pull pranks and gags on the player, and it understands that bullshit plus non-linearity is a combination that doesn't work with hardcore punishment. Fake floors, enemy ambushes, water bits, it would all smack of bullshit if progress were crushed. Like, yeah, it kinda sucks when you fall through a floor into a poison lake, but if you die, you respawn right where you died. The only theoretical punishment is that you lose your money and experience when you get a game over, which is 3 deaths. However, neither of these punishments ever amounts to much. Simon's Quest's structure makes money and experience not matter a whole lot, with money being useless for pretty boring reasons, and experience being pretty useless for much more exciting and sexy reasons. One thing that is certainly not useless is this channel's supporters on Patreon.com and here on YouTube as YouTube members. The names you see on screen are the supporters that make this channel possible. Without their generous support, I'd have to get a second job that sucks, whereas doing these videos is awesome. If you'd like to see more videos and streams, consider supporting through Patreon or YouTube. Links are in the description below, and support gets you a nice smorgasbord of benefits. Sadly, though, we gotta get back to playing Simon's Quests. And what must be the pinnacle of the hearts not being healing in Castlevania joke, in Simon's Quest hearts serve as money, sub-weapon ammo, and experience points. Literally everything except healing. I know I just said 4 seconds ago that money is useless, but it's actually quite precious at the beginning of the game, when the player needs to get 150 hearts altogether to buy the White Crystal, Thorn Whip, and Holy Water to get their adventure started. Since these items are all purchased in the starting town, that means grinding, as there isn't really an organic way to get these funds together while maintaining forward momentum. Beyond that opening, money is used throughout the game for a few more whip upgrades and to buy garlic and laurels. Because of the amount of monsters the player fights, money is almost never an issue when it comes to buying these items. After the opening farm session, the only time money can get tight is when you need to buy oak stakes. I'm sorry, invest in oak stakes. Even if you unfortunately lose all your money in the middle of a dungeon, however, hearts are issued in such large denominations that it takes no time to get the oak stake funds together. Simon begins the game at level 0 and can reach level 6. I beat the game at level 2, and the reason for that is twofold. The first is that experience points required to level up are obscene. Experience is not gained from killing enemies, but is instead gained when you pick up hearts, and it is specifically 3/4 the monetary value of a heart that you get in experience. So experience is a random drop, and the amount needed to level up increases by 50 with each level. To get to level 3, you need 250 experience, or about 333 hearts, and hearts, while common enough to buy the basic items throughout the game, don't add up to 333 very quickly. Most hearts are worth about $4 in the mid to late game, but not all hearts that you get actually confer experience. In order to prevent grinding, levels are capped depending on what part of the game you're in. So while you can reach level 1 in the starting village, you can't reach level 2 until you're in an area beyond the first mansion or dungeon in the game. For a game from 1987, this is a surprisingly simple and effective level grinding prevention. Capping levels based on area means that Simon is never more powerful than intended. But no one talks about levels because they don't really matter. Level ups give Simon more health or higher defense depending on the level attained. The problem is that no matter what level Simon is at, enemies in this game never pose a threat. Some are tough, and the nighttime enemies can be rambunctious, but since you always respawn right where you died, you can bullhead your way through the entire game. Besides, the encounters you would think to be tough, the bosses are all very simple. There are only 3 in the game: Death, the newcomer Carmilla, and Dracula himself. Death is optional and probably the hardest fight, while Carmilla and Dracula can be easily cheesed. The Golden Dagger, the item drop from Death, is probably the best incarnation of the dagger subweapon. When it hits, it leaves a flame that strikes an enemy, similar to the Holy Water in Castlevania I. This flame completely stun-locks Carmilla and Dracula. To be fair, I can't think of a more iconic duo than Dracula and getting stun-locked, but Simon's Quest has a disappointing boss roster. Even if you fight Carmilla straight up, it's a repetitive and simple fight. There isn't any memorable combat in the whole game really, as most enemies are simple or can be skipped, including Death. You just walk past him if you don't feel like fighting him. And Golden Dagger's pretty good, but that's also kind of, you know what? I'll give the game points for that one. Actually, I think I will. The real gatekeeper to each area isn't how much damage Simon takes, but how much damage he deals. The whip upgrades are the only levels that matter, and they can get pretty badass, from a basic Thorn Whip to a Morning Star and then the Supreme Flame Whip. These upgrades are necessary, especially when the scary nighttime enemies come out. Famously, the game has a day and a night cycle that is announced with big, slow block text as, "What a horrible night to have a curse." This mechanic sucks, but not for the canonical reason of it being cumbersome. Nah, it sucks because at nighttime, the towns and shopkeepers go away, so if you need a heal from the church or to buy an item, then your only option is to sit around and wait. The transition to nighttime is scary, especially if you're caught away from town. Suddenly, the enemies get stronger and more plentiful. Early on, panic sets in when night arrives. But then you remember that death doesn't matter, so who cares? What's interesting about day and night is that the game does keep track of how many day and night cycles Simon has been through. The quality of the ending is based on how many days pass. The fewer days, the better ending. I got the shit ending. Simon's Quest is ultimately a game of false starts. It has a bunch of mechanics that will become staple in later games: open-ended exploration, level ups, and upgrading gear. The day and night cycle would become the A and B castles of later games, but it doesn't synergize here. It's too easy for many of the special powers or weapons like the dagger and diamond to matter, level ups don't matter, and it's too convoluted, at least in the official English translation, for the exploration to be satisfying. Is Simon's Quest a good game? I don't know. I enjoyed it, but with tempered expectations and a proclivity for camp. It's also something of an oasis at this point in the series between the much more gruesome Castlevania and Castlevania III. It might be misplaced ambition and a not-so-successful early attempt at Metroidvania, but the hustle is something I can respect. Why While on its own merits, it might be the least successful in the second game in an NES series that completely changes the formula subgenre, the legacy of Simon's Quest is stronger than otherwise superior games like Zelda 2 and Super Mario Bros. 2. For Symphony of the Night and the entire Metroidvania genre to run, Simon's Quest had to walk, fall over, bust its ass, fart, shit, and barf its way to the finish line. It's a mess. A charming mess, but a mess. A mess we should absolutely cherish and parade around. Thank you for watching, and come join me next time when we'll be diving headfirst into the final NES Castlevania game, Castlevania III, Dracula's Curse. And after rolling Simon's Quest, Dracula's Curse is... well, you'll see.